You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. We are back, and I'm really excited to talk about a topic that often gets pushed aside in yoga. We were talking about this just a moment ago before we hopped on, and how everyone loves the hips, and yoga teachers will relate to that. If you ever ask your class what they want, it's always hips, and yet the shoulders are so important. There's so many great things to look at with the shoulders. And so what we want to do with this episode is really talk about the importance of the shoulders, stabilizing, mobilizing, other issues in the body, weight bearing in yoga, and then look at some tools that can be helpful. Now, of course, a therapeutic practice is really individualized. So if you're having injuries or issues going on, you should always consult someone in person. And luckily, one of the pros to COVID is a lot of our yoga medicine therapeutic specialists are online now. So if you don't have one near you, you can find one on our Find a Teacher page if you go to yogamedicine.com. So with that disclaimer aside, the therapeutics is very individualized. We'll give some of our favorite tools for supporting shoulder issues as best we can in a podcast format. Of course, there's so much more to learn, and we have a full-length teacher training on the shoulder, of course, if you want deeper information. But we're going to do our best to fill you in and give you some stuff to work with.
And hopefully create some excitement because, I love an underdog, but I really see the shoulders as this kind of underdog joint. People get excited about the hips, as you said, they get excited about the spine. There seems to be this instinctive understanding of their importance, but nobody gets excited about the shoulders. And we should, because they have such a massive and I think underappreciated impact in our practice, but even outside our practice in general life. So that's one of my goals. I'm hoping people leave with a higher level of shoulder-related excitement.
Appreciation. Give those shoulders some appreciation. Everyone needs some appreciation. Mm-hmm. And, rightfully so. I'm just going to jump right in, and we're going to kind of keep this really conversational. I think one of the most interesting things about the shoulder is the fact that it's such a mobile joint. If you're familiar with the bony structure of the shoulder, it really sits, like the hip really is so encased in its bony structure of the acetabulum. But with the shoulder, it really looks more like a golf ball on a tee. It's a very small, as far as the bony structure really encasing it and holding it in place. It's a joint that's made for a lot of mobility because we don't walk around on our hands all day. Even if you're
most of us,
even if you're doing handstands, you need to be able to weight bear. Maybe you're there for a minute or two. If you're really good, maybe 2 minutes. But what they're really made for is mobility. And so the importance of the shoulders for function, especially when we start to weight bear in a yoga setting, if you're not used to doing that, is something that kind of needs to be worked up to. And there's so many carryovers into how we feel in our body, just like the hips. And, I think the hips and low back are one of the most common issues of people and discomfort that influence our experience in our body and our ability to really appreciate life. But the shoulders are also one, especially for people with chronic neck tension, upper back issues, can often be, there can often be underpinnings in the shoulder and the upper extremity. So
and I kind of feel like people tolerate some level of dysfunction in their shoulders the way that they don't seem to. With the hips and the low back, they're motivated to solve the problem and get to the root of the cause and get themselves sorted out. But people seem to just kind of put up with shoulder pain or discomfort or limited range of motion or things that they just don't do or just can't do and seem to accept that as just, it's not a big deal. It's just my shoulder. Whereas I feel like if they put the same kind of love and care into the shoulder joints as they do others, the outcomes would be different. And the impacts, as you said, on neck, upper back. We'll also talk, I'm sure, about posture and breathing, really big carryover effects.
Well, and I think rightfully so, because many of us, especially now, sit at our desks most of the day, or
Mm,
we're walking or running or biking or doing something with our lower extremity. But it's easier to neglect the shoulder and kind of just see it as this nagging tension or nagging issue. And then what happens is people start practicing yoga and they're asking a lot of their shoulder. They're putting their whole body weight on top of this joint, which
mm,
is designed to be capable of managing that. It's just not always a guarantee, especially if we've never done it before. Our body
mm,
really, and we've talked about this in this podcast before, but we train it to the demands. And so it's always adapting to in response to those demands, whether that
mm,
means being sedentary, whether that means being really active. Maybe you're a runner who never really does a lot on your hands. I think most athletes do a lot of cross training, but every athlete is very different how much
mm.
cross training they do. And then all of us are sitting at our desks more, right? It's like it's easy to ignore. I always say
Yeah.
it's interesting too with yoga, because a lot of times we can blame injuries on yoga, and of course we can injure ourselves with yoga, but it's also partly that yoga like turns a spotlight on almost every part of the body. And so if that shoulder joint hasn't ever been asked to do much before, and then all of a sudden
Mm.
we want it to bear our weight in a vinyasa class for an hour and a half, like it's gonna talk back.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with the shoulders, isn't it? Because I think many people know that they are mobile joints. There's multiple bones involved. The joints are relatively shallow, as you said, in terms of bone on bone contact. And also the muscles that surround them and control their position are, for most of us, quite unfamiliar. We might not even know the names of half the muscles that influence the shoulders. And so we have this perception that maybe they're not supposed to be particularly strong or stable, that maybe they are just meant to be this mobile joint. And I think if you look outside the yoga world to gymnastics, to weightlifting, to calisthenics, you can see that there are lots of places that people routinely train the shoulders to be much more than just mobile joints. They're definitely capable of carrying our weight, but it's something that they do need to be trained for. You know, most of us are standing on our feet and walking around, and we can assume some level of standing stability. You can't do that when it comes to weight bearing on your hands, because it's just a completely different kettle of fish. And even trying to use the muscles to create stability when they're unfamiliar muscles that we might not have tapped into before can be an unexpected challenge. So, yeah.
And I think talking really briefly too about some crossover areas, and we've already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I find so much people who have neck issues, you spend
Mm,
so much time trying to work on those darn neck muscles, and yet you go in the side door and work on their shoulder, and all of a sudden it's this magical experience. Especially, of course, you've got to put this in context. There's no magic bullet, right? Yoga can be really helpful for a lot of things, doing just generic, simple practices. However, everyone's different. But from my experience, people with neck pain, I love working through the armpit. I love working on that
mm.
rotator cuff. I,
I was nodding emphatically until you said the armpit, and I was like, "Oh, tender, maybe not so much." But
you'd
in
love it.
theory, I'm with you.
You'll love. I
Bet you
just
I wouldn't.
a whole class on the armpit for you, Rachel.
Oh, no, please God, no, no.
It's so good though. I can't tell you how many patients I've worked with who have that like chronic lingering nagging upper trap tension that
Hmm.
they've tried all the things for, and they go get all their massages for, and we've done the acupuncture for, and all sorts of different things, and it never quite goes away. Now again, there's other reasons for this. I think sometimes it's, representative of sometimes what's going on in our lives, mental, emotional things that we're working through, and maybe serves a place in
Mm,
another realm. But in my experience, working in the armpit is such a great one. Like I'm talking about myofascial work, really, like being on a foam roller on your side with the foam roller or
Yes.
block, yoga block.
Okay, I'm back with you again. Back with you. This is one of my favorite practices. I'm on board.
In your armpit, because you get this perfect trifecta. You can get into pec,
Yes.
you can get into lats, you can get into the serratus. If you get a ball and know how to angle it just right, you can get into subscap, which is part of
Yeah,
the
that's the one I was thinking of was, oh,
that one's a 10.
along those same lines though, outside of myofascial release, I found the same thing. People with really nagging kind of neck or upper shoulder or even mid back kind of heart rate monitor region. Working shoulder
Mm,
stability has been a game changer. Working posterior shoulder strength has been a game changer because your instinct is, oh, it's tight, it's tense. We'll find some ways to relax those muscles and stretch them out. And sometimes they're just doing double duty. You know, they're trying to work for muscles that aren't carrying their weight. And so
yeah.
even getting that little bit more activation can make a huge
And
difference.
even sometimes in like bodybuilders, which you would think,
Mm,
okay, they're doing enough strength work. They really just need some MFR and stretching and release work to balance that out, which is sometimes the case. But in my experience, even with bodybuilders, because they're usually training the, like the large
yeah,
visible
superficial, good
muscles,
looking ones.
the good looking muscles. And so finding some balance in the, deeper layer of muscles that act as that like support system and also
Hmm.
make the large muscles more efficient, more impactful, more powerful
Yeah.
by kind of presetting the joint so that they can be more powerful. But I find that that can be a really big one. And I'm glad you said that because I think that's so true, not just for the shoulder, but for so many nagging long-term things. People love, I feel like we talk about this a lot in our teacher trainings. You sell people as a yoga teacher on the MFR, they fall in love with
Yes.
it. They get that
Quick
instant,
fix.
well, and they get instant relief, which,
Yes.
rightfully so. We're human. We want to feel some effects, and it's hard to keep going if it takes a few months to feel some changes, which is what we're talking
Mm,
about a lot of times with muscle changes. We're talking about usually at least a month or two to really see a diligent work to see changes in the
yeah.
muscular system and a few months for the connective tissue. So the MFR is what sells people.
Mm,
But if I don't do more than that, usually, not always, but usually I become dependent on that. And then we've
yeah.
all seen the students who love the MFR and then they're like obsessively doing it all the time, which isn't necessarily a bad, there's worse things. But for me as a practitioner, it's always been really important to me as a healthcare provider and as a yoga teacher to empower people with resources to not make them dependent on me. Of course,
Yes.
I want them to see me as a resource and come back when, they need me, but I don't want to make them dependent on me. So giving them these tools to be able to move the needle and not just like put a band-aid on it or give them
Yeah.
symptomatic relief is so important. So the MFR is like it's the buy-in. People love you. Now they know that you actually know your stuff and they're gonna
Hmm.
listen to you and you
And
build
they get a really
trust.
vivid feeling and experience. They know something's happening, as opposed to strength work where you don't always feel that really instant impact. It's not such a vivid feeling. I was going to say, actually, that's one of the things I love about myofascial release because there are so many small muscles that surround the shoulders, slightly different angles and depths, and largely unfamiliar, that myofascial release can be this incredible way to get people familiar with, oh, that spot right there, that feeling versus that one that's just 2 centimeters or an inch lower down or closer to the spine or closer to the side ribs, can really help them get a, a roadmap in their own mind of where these tissues are, where there's tension, where there's a sensation that they've never connected with before. Like, I've never felt anything around that spot in my life. You can kind of get them familiar through myofascial release, which to me has this capacity to really cut through the nervous system and present it with something new and novel. And we know how much the brain likes paying attention to new things. So it can be that in, not just
Yeah.
because they like it and they get quick relief, but because they suddenly get experiences there.
Yeah. And thank you, because I think it's a nod to yes, there's so much more that the MFR is doing. I'm not trying to minimize it because we could talk a
Oh,
whole
yeah.
episode on MFR and its
And I'm
uses.
sure we will at some point.
It's not just a band-aid, it's not just pain relief. There's a lot going on. However, as a yoga
Mm,
teacher, I think it's such a great tool to not only give them some quick relief, also work with them over time and also build trust. And but a lot of times that the finesse of creating more stability in the joint and support in that
mm,
support system, that again we said it's designed to be capable to well, we know even in athletes to lift a lot more than our body weight, but
mm.
in our instances in yoga to definitely be able to support efficiently, support our body weight and beyond, and be able to move through that too maybe. um, it just needs a little bit of help, and
Mm.
the strength work and the stability work I think can be more tedious, and if you're a yoga teacher and listen to this, you are like, yes, yes, it's so hard to get them to stay
It's
on, but
hard to sell.
always reminding them too, like the MFR, this is going to be important. This is great for you now, but this thing that you don't like as much, like this is the long term. This is your freedom.
Hmm.
This is your freedom that's going to take a little while, and you're not going to see the effects of it right away, but it's going to build over time. And it's really important that you do these things regularly to retrain the system, both
Mm.
the strength in the muscle and the nervous system to control that, and the connective tissue that unites it all, the whole system
Yes.
working together. So I think that's so important. Those conversations, I think a lot of the impact of what we do as yoga teachers is in those short and succinct conversations that we have to fill
Mm.
people in and set expectations. And it's no different with the shoulder.
And you've spoken about like the vinyasa yoga student, you've spoken about athletes, but with some of the people that I work with who are older, the shoulders can have a massive impact on, I'm thinking about posture here. We all have the tendency as we get older for the shoulders to kind of drift forward and the chest. Well, I say all, that's not routinely true, but for most of us, we tend to get a little more rounded as we get older, thanks to gravity, which we've already cursed many times in previous podcasts, and creating a little bit more strength and mobility in the shoulders can have a huge impact. And I think about the change of posture, which changes people's self perception. I've said this before, but nobody wants to be that little old man or little old lady at the grocery store bent over double. And with older students, getting the shoulders to work in a more varied range of positions to get them forward, yes, but also back and down, and to have an overhead reach through the arm changes their perception of themselves from being that rounded little old man or little old lady to being somebody who's stronger and more capable. And then strength work on the upper body, plank, side plank, all of this stuff makes people feel stronger and more capable.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can't really underestimate the impact that that can have psychologically.
I was just remembering, this is not a quote. I don't remember exactly what was said, but BKS Iyengar used to often, talk about working with people with depression. Like the biggest issue is getting them to stand up straight, like
Mm,
work on your posture. And it's so big. I know in Chinese medicine, there's a really important acupuncture point here. It's lung one, uh, if you want to know, but it's right here in the pecs, and it's such a big one for posture. And in Chinese
mm.
medicine, we use it for self-esteem and self-worth, and like that change of perspective that you're talking about, how we carry our
Yes.
shoulders can resemble a lot of other things that we carry around of our past, our history, our emotional state, our mental state. And so
Mm.
obviously, like everything in the body, there's so much more behind
Yeah.
it. And so I love our work as yoga teachers because you know, it's one of the few professions in the therapeutic realm where we really get to spend a good amount of time with people. And we're
Mm.
the ones who really get to see all the layers as a healthcare provider. Like, and as with my acupuncture patients, I'm lucky to spend, you know, their whole treatment is an hour, but I might spend 20 minutes with them, maybe
Mm.
30, usually with each person. And as a yoga teacher, you get to spend the whole hour and
Yeah.
really get to know them and the layers of them. I remember a patient, in particular who I was working with, who had shoulder pain, and she also had lower back pain as well. but we were doing all this mechanical stuff for her, and I think it was like a month or two in, and things were kind of helping a little bit. And I found out she had had a miscarriage right before it all started,
Mm.
and so I'm like, oh gosh, shift gears.
Change tack,
We
yeah.
need the emotional support, we need the mental support here. Um, and instead of all this like mechanical crap that didn't really matter, you
Yeah.
know?
I
So
always tend to lean towards the mechanical stuff too. I mean, that's usually where I start. Like what patterns have you been in? What kind of grooves are you creating in the central nervous system that we might balance out or just make more flexible? But I can't deny it as much as I'd like to. There's definitely more going on than just muscles, fascia, joints.
but I love that. I think the physical. I was talking to someone about this recently, and the thing I love about the physical as a yoga teacher is something everyone can relate to.
Yeah,
Not
it's that in.
everyone's going through emotional or mental or spiritual or energetic shifts that need to be. I mean, I think everyone can benefit from work on all the layers, but we can all connect to the physical. And I
Mm.
think there's an important kind of entryway there, and then we find other things sometimes. But um,
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think in my head, the hips sort of sit in this category of they carry us through our lives. They're our sort of independence and our propulsion. But the shoulders, and then by extension, the arms and the hands, are more about connection and creativity and
hmm,
reaching out and holding hands or shaking hands or hugging or painting or drawing or writing. They, when you think about the energetic side of things, they have for me different connotations than the more
hmm.
practical hips, which is why it always surprises me when people say emotions are stored in the hips and only the hips and nowhere else in the body, because I don't think that's true. I feel like we can access emotions in some really surprising places,
I think it
including the
depends
chest,
on the person.
shoulders, and
But
maybe
like
the emotion.
our arms are our capacity to interact with the world, right? Our
Yes.
hands, our arms, and it can show up in so many different ways. So it's such an important area. And I just realized I kind of started to talk about this earlier, and then I got
We
caught
got
in a
excited.
tangent. But what I was hinting at before too is that it's really an important area to look at for other things going on, namely neck issues. So I started out with
Mm,
neck issues. Is one I often will work on the shoulder first. I find it to be often more helpful than direct work on the neck.
same.
Um, Upper back issues as
Hmm.
well. Again, you got to put it in the context of the person you're working with and what they're doing or not doing already. And then respiratory issues,
100%.
respiratory mechanics. I think those three are
Because I
so
think what we forget, going back to the more physical mechanical side, is the arms hang off the shoulders, and the arms, even if you're not a bodybuilder, even if they aren't massive, they're still heavy. And so even a slight
important.
shift in the position of the shoulders means you've got weight shifting, which then means some other part of the body needs to shift to compensate, because your body is always moving through that sea of gravity, as you call it. So something else is going to have to adjust to take up the slack or to compensate. And so all of those little changes you could address at the neck or at the back. You could try to teach people to, breathe more deeply or to access their side ribs. But if there's been a real movement in the shoulders, and now the weight of the arms is hanging forward, or somewhere out of where it would normally be, you're going to see those impacts. And it might be quicker just to go to the source, get the weight to shift back towards center, and then you've got an easier job with the rest of it. And I love that you mentioned breathing, because I think we tend to think about the breath as something that just happens on the inside, and all you need to do is think about taking a deep breath, and a deep breath will happen. But if we don't have space to breathe into, if there isn't room for the rib cage to expand and the
Mhm.
abdomen to descend and the side ribs to widen, where's that deep breath going to come from?
And I think there's a good little experiment too you can do just as you're maybe if you're sitting, if you're standing too, is just like exaggerating and rounding your shoulders and then trying to take a deep breath. You recognize really quickly how challenging that is. And we
Mm.
forget, and if you're not familiar with the anatomy, you might not be aware of this, but a lot of times, even if you know, we forget that the upper arm bone, the humerus, actually connects to the shoulder blade or the scapula, which then connects to the clavicle. and then connects into the sternum, or this kind of axial skeleton, which is kind of the central part of the body here. And so if you think about the arm connecting into the clavicle and then rounding forward, you kind of get this sense of the weight, the whole weight of the upper extremities, as you said, which is a lot,
Mm.
it's pretty significant, pulling us forward along with gravity now, and then closing off that space for the diaphragm to be able to really expand and the belly to be able to expand, and really limiting us to upper rib cage breathing, which then kicks in a lot of these accessory
The
respiratory
neck.
muscles in the neck,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
shoulders, and the wrist.
It's
But
been such an interesting process for me filming classes over the past couple of years and then having to watch them to edit them. And I've noticed all kinds of patterns in myself, especially that tendency to breathe with my neck instead of actually breathing way, way lower down and just creating space for the breath to unfold. And the more I look around, the more common I see that pattern to be. So you can see how working at the source by looking at the shoulders would just make breathing itself become much more effortless. You don't have to work so hard when things are in the right place. But it wouldn't be a yoga medicine podcast if we didn't hedge our bets. So we've talked a bit about rounded shoulders and anterior shoulders and the weight of the arms coming forward. And I know that there is a small percentage of people out there who will take that opposite to the extreme. Like, well, I've got to keep my shoulder blades back and down at all times. I've got to have military posture. I'm going to squeeze those shoulder blades together. And that's not how they're meant to be either. They really are mobile and they are meant to glide around on the rib cage. Most of the things that we use our hands for are in front of the body. So they are to some extent meant to be forward. We're both trying to sit up straighter.
I think sometimes too, for people who are yoga enthusiasts, people who practice regularly, sometimes the bigger issue is people really trying to force some of that
Yes.
alignment in there, or force
Fix
the
them in
shoulder
place.
blades down. That creates more of a struggle because we forget the upper traps, or the traps, are one continuous muscle from upper to lower. That upper trap is what we think of in the neck and the top of the shoulders there, the part that tends to get really tense. The lower traps are, you know, definitely more on the weak side. But anytime I really over exaggerate that movement, even if I'm trying to push them down, I find those upper traps tend to come on board because they're the big guns. They're like, oh, okay, she wants to do the heavy lifting. We're here. Like, we're here to
Yeah.
help out. And and so anytime I over exaggerate some of that strength work, they tend to like to help out.
Mm.
Which is why yoga becomes a great tool, because we can kind of finesse and nuance things, which can be a great counterbalance for athletes and weightlifters and people who are really working on these large muscle groups, who really need that mobility as well to be able to do
Mm.
well, not only their sport or their weightlifting, but also life, to do life.
Yeah, I always I always think about, the more you talk about athletes, the more I think about the experiences that I see at the other end of the spectrum of people who are, still fit and active, but older. And even just having limitations in range of motion can make a big difference in terms of, can you reach up to that top shelf in the kitchen, or can you stretch around behind you to get
Mhm.
something from the back seat of the car? Can you take your shirt off overhead, or is that something that's uncomfortable? Even when it gets just to little things in daily life, you could have this constant low level irritation that people do seem to put up with, or you could work on the shoulders and just move through your life with a bit more ease. I hope I'm selling it to people here.
Well,
Shoulders are important, people. Appreciate them.
and I think as a yoga teacher, it's kind of like the lower back. One, we talk a lot about how with lower back pain is the most common issue people have, whether you're going to the doctor or going to yoga. And so you can always assume there's people with lower back pain in your class. But I think the same is true. Like, I think there's something to benefit from looking at the shoulder. And this is why, as a yoga teacher, I think, in a group class, we can't cater to one person. So as a group teacher, I'm always just trying to kind of find something to focus on, to give some insights, so that the people who study with me over time have an arsenal of tools. And when that one thing clicks and they come up to you and they're like, oh my gosh, that was so helpful. It's like, great, now focus on that, bring it into your next practice, like,
Yeah.
carry it with you. You've got a tool. And so I think the shoulders are one of those really powerful tools that gets overlooked
Mm.
and maybe not like the biggest one, like the low back and the hip, but is a very important one to look at. And for athletes, for older, for younger, for middle
Desk
age,
workers,
and
people who
what's
do a lot of time gaming.
yeah, I mean, yeah, yes, desk workers, we all can feel that. But back to the posture thing too, is I think
Mm.
posture is such a great one to look at because it's something I can come back to. And we know that the things that we can do more frequently are probably going to be more impactful. So if I'm able to just kind of notice my even simple things like just noticing your posture at the computer from time to time, or when you're standing at in a line somewhere or in your yoga practice, it can be a really convenient tool. However, like Rachel said, it's not everything, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at the bony structure of the shoulder, I always love it's always like the beginning of the shoulder training, and we plant the seed, and it's like, okay, now let that sit. The glenoid fossa, which is the little cup that the head of the humerus or the upper arm bone sits in, it actually turns somewhat forward. It's not facing straight out to the side in this straight
Yes.
jacket position, which we love, which I'm not saying you should throw that out in yoga because I think it does teach some wonderful retraction and,
Hmm.
support in another way. But it's not like the way we're designed to be standing all the time. Our
Mm.
glenoid fossa, our shoulder joint, actually naturally in a healthy state turns a little bit forward. And so we always line up people in our training so people can see. And it's really fun because we line up. I usually try and get like 10 or so people who don't have shoulder issues, and then 10 or so people with right side shoulder issues. It's usually a big group, so we can usually find all of those. And then we compare them. And at the end of that, it's always the same. What we see is there's a variety of shoulder carriage, the
Hmm.
positioning of the shoulder in both groups that isn't necessarily synonymous with shoulder pain.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's a longer conversation and there's a context that's important, but there's also bony structure. And then
Hmm.
remembering that our body is accommodating and responding to demands and changing in response to that. And, on and on and on. But what we can't do as yoga teachers is just assume that because someone's shoulders are forward, that they're having pain or that it's something that needs to be changed or fixed, unless
Mm.
it's really significant, maybe. And then on your spectrum, like with seniors, sometimes there are bony changes. And so we also have to be careful with setting expectations because when there are
Yes.
bony changes with kyphosis in an elderly population, I'm not going to tell them that we're going to we're probably not going to be able to change all of that. We can help, and we can help with their feeling in their body,
That's exactly it.
but I'm not going to
That's
change their
exactly what
body.
I was going to talk about.
Oh,
Posture
sorry.
is important and it is impactful. I 100% agree, but you can definitely mess yourself up just as effectively by
Yeah.
fixing the shoulder blades back and down as you can by having them always down and forward. I think just movement for these joints more than maybe any other joints in the body, just to keep refreshing the gliding surfaces, to keep refreshing the muscles, not just around the shoulders, but a lot of the muscles that connect to the shoulders also run through the neck to connect to the base of the skull. So, refreshing the shoulders refreshes the head and neck, changes the patterns that you're creating in the upper back, which then changes the patterns that you're creating in the lower back. So, refreshment. And even for people who their posture is not going to change, just being able to get in touch with the muscles on the back of the body and to get the shoulder blades moving through whatever options they have on the rib cage makes a completely different feeling in that whole joint complex.
And, if you're teaching a group class, I think kind of along the lines of what you're saying, diversity of movement is important, diversity of challenge. And if you're a student or a teacher, if you're a teacher, you're also a student. But as a student in this practice, I think curiosity is really key. And in the sense that I'm really curious to see what's challenging or what's limited as
Mm.
areas that I can um, start to capture some growth and helpful changes rather than kind of I think our human nature a lot of times is to push those away. Like, oh my gosh, it's hard. So quick, don't let anyone see I'm struggling. I mean, we all do it. I do it like quick, rather than like, oh, this is hard. I'm going to slow down and really see if I can capture some awareness here. And I think, I don't want to overly simplify it, but if I can capture that curiosity to linger in those moments, I think that can be a very potent therapeutic modality in and of itself.
100%. But I also see people who have the tendency to push themselves too much. And I remember in my teacher training, one of the things that they said was make a list of the poses that you hate. They're the ones you need to practice.
Mm.
And I disagree. I definitely phrase it in my mind much more the way that you did. Find the things that are difficult, find the things that are challenging, find the things that are awkward. But often the things that I hate for a reason because they feel wrong or they hurt or they make me feel off or out. So for me, there's a distinction between if it just feels awful, that isn't necessarily something that you need to get curious about, although you might. Why is it awful? How is it awful? Where is it awful? What's the quality of the sensation? But to find your kind of blind spots is more what I'm interested in.
Mhm.
And I
Exactly.
feel like that it's a subtle distinction, but it's important because I do see sometimes people really fighting the natural rhythm of the shoulder joint. Like as the arm goes overhead, the especially the bottom tip of the shoulder blade needs to lift, it needs to rotate. And somehow in the world, it's still out there, the idea that you always have to have your shoulder blades back and down, no matter what you're doing with your arms. So that feeling of, oh, I'm kind of jammed and there's nowhere I can go is there for a reason. It's there to tell you that you do need to let your shoulder blades lift a little bit, especially the outer edge of the shoulder blades as you lift your arms, as opposed to trying to fix them in place. So there's a distinction between the stuff you just hate versus the things that are interesting, difficult, challenging, dormant. Like, oh, I haven't connected to that before. I haven't tried to do that before. Why can't I do it? Why is that different on the left side versus the right side? I think that's why curiosity is something that has come up in, I think, every single episode of the podcast.
It is. It's such a I feel like I come back to that word all the time. I mean, it's such a great it's a guide because as soon as we close ourselves off to learning, there's no more growth. And the
Hmm.
curiosity is what opens us up to the learning, to the beginner's mind, and which is so important in meditation and in the asanas, I think is really what really helps us inhabit the moment to be present, and it kind of naturally clears out a lot of the filters that we have that tell us like this is good or this is bad,
Hmm.
and instead of just really sensing and feeling into that intuition and awareness in the body, we have so much of that built in. So next, what I want to do, let's talk about before we get to some tools, which we've already talked about some already, really. But let's talk
We
about.
always do jump around a little, don't we?
I know it's good. It flows. But let's talk about how the shoulder shows up in a yoga practice because there's so many
Mm,
different ways. And like if you think about all the different scenarios with weight bearing, like down dog is the obvious one that comes up. Chaturanga is probably the next one. Side plank, inversions. There's a
yeah,
lot of weight bearing positions. And if someone's sitting at their desk all day and has never done yoga before, that's a lot.
yeah. It's probably the biggest adjustment that new vinyasa yoga students, I think, make. The hands, the wrists, the arms, the shoulders suddenly getting used to carrying some body weight.
Which they're designed to. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's just a matter of like slow dripping yourself into it. Like, don't
Mm,
be afraid to skip those vinyasas. Our ego is, kind of there and telling us like, you can do this. And we feel like we can, and maybe we can. And I
yeah.
know, most people can do a lot of down dogs and chaturangas and maybe never get injured, and their body is fine with that. I'm not saying that by starting a yoga practice, you're inherently going to injure your shoulders because most people don't.
No.
But I think like everything, it's important to kind of work our way into it, especially if you haven't
Yeah.
done a lot of weight bearing on your arms and just recognizing that. And as a
Yeah.
teacher, planting those seeds in a positive way. I never want to instill fear. I never want to instill this like fear of injury. That you should never do that because you're new and you're going to injure yourself. Like That doesn't help anyone. But
No, but
in a
you got
positive
to get
way.
used to it. If it's new to you, you got to give your body a chance to get used to it. It would be like me deciding today that I'm going to run a marathon and then running a marathon today, as opposed to, letting my body adjust slowly to increases in distance and time. The body is incredibly adaptive, but not in an instant. It
Yeah.
needs time.
Body's amazing. And so, it's why I think beginner series are so great to be able to
Yes.
offer those. I know you have one on the yoga medicine platform, and as a teacher, then I can just kind of sprinkle those in and I can talk
Mm.
to some of these key components. Like, if you were to do a beginner series, you'd want to talk about some of the essentials of shoulder stability as well as lower back and hips and, you know, a lot of other things. There's a lot of components. You can decide as a teacher what's most important to you. Maybe, intro to mindfulness or philosophy or other things as well. Um, but I definitely think a little bit of intro to shoulders if it's a vinyasa, if beginner's
Mm.
class for vinyasa, so important. We want to empower our students, and our shoulders are powerful. They're powerful. And I hate it when you start to see some of the media, kind of demonizing chaturanga or,
The shoulder shredder.
like vinyasa is so bad for your shoulders. And I think it's really unfortunate to just kind of throw things away because I think there's a place and a challenge for everyone that's really, depends on the person and what you want and
I
what
think
your
the
goals
challenge with,
are.
yeah, I think the challenge with chaturanga is it's not something that we break down every single class, nor should it be, because God, that would be so boring. I would hate to
Yes.
teach and I would hate to practice those classes. But if you've been practicing group classes for a while, it could be a while since the teacher broke down chaturanga and talked through that transition in phases so that you had a chance to figure out what's going on in plank, what's going on as you shift forward, what's going on as you bend your elbows. Where do you want to pause if you're going to pause in chaturanga? And I think this is why beginners series are great, because it's not always just beginners who do it. Often it's students who've been practicing for a while and have just never had the experience to really slow down, dissect, explore. It can be really helpful sometimes to, in theory, regress from your
And
capacity to learn about something.
by the way, those beginner classes are a lot of times more challenging, not in an accessibility way. They're very accessible, but because
But
you're
there's
going
detail.
slower and it's more detailed, I think beginners classes are good for everyone. I mean, it may
Mm.
not be your primary practice all the time, but I love dipping into a beginner's class from time to time as a way to really,
And I always learn something that I
yeah.
missed when I was a beginner that just didn't land then. Now is like, damn. And I've been practicing this for like 35 years. Somehow missed that cue or that action or that little adjustment. So I agree. I think there's nothing inherently wrong with chaturanga, like there's nothing inherently wrong with any pose. But when it comes up so often and often at speed and often without detailed cueing, because it's the nature of it, it's a transitionary pose, it can be great to take the opportunity either to slow it down, break it down, figure out how you can best support yourself, and two, to pepper in some alternatives. You don't need to do chaturanga in every single
Mhm.
vinyasa. You don't need to take every single vinyasa. You could hold plank. You could come to side plank. Lots of options.
Honestly, I wish that I could get everyone who's new to vinyasa, new to yoga, to do chaturanga with their knees down for like 6 months. I think
Yeah.
I think everyone could benefit from that, but no one wants to do it because most people can do chaturanga with their knees up, but because we're able to put the knees down, it gives us a little bit of leeway there to
Yes.
really finesse and dissect and really create some powerful support there. And a
Mm.
lot of people, because we tend to skip that, there's no like guide, in every class for like brand new people. Oh, you're new. You stand in this slot and you'll do these poses. Like there's really no
That would be
guide for that
great.
unless it's a beginner series. But
Mm.
like if I could get every person who's new to do that, I just think it creates such a difference in how the shoulders respond to that challenge.
Mm.
Am I on overdrive and I'm just like, we've got to make this happen? Or am I like, oh, here we are, we're rising to the occasion and we're finding that
Yeah.
strength and efficiency that can then build and translate into bigger movements. And I find that if I can convince people to do that, that eventually over time, when I start to challenge those tissues, whether that be in arm balances or inversions or side plank variations, that it's just a lot easier. They're
Mhm.
teaching the tissues to respond in a more effortless way than if I were just overwhelming them every time and teaching them to respond in that overwhelm, in that
Yes.
tension and like, yeah.
I love that. I think varying the load is so important because we said before the brain loves novelty. So if you're always doing chaturanga with straight legs and rushing through it, I definitely tend to rush through it, get it over and done with, and get to the beautiful back bend afterwards. Then vary the load, pop your knees down, and suddenly you buy yourself a whole heap of time. Maybe you linger there for a breath. Maybe you play with a couple of different, slightly different shoulder positions to kind of see where you feel like you could float or you could bounce, or where there's a
Mhm.
little bit more support and a little bit less of the neck.
Because it should feel kind of buoyant there. And,
Mm.
I look around in most classes and everyone's just like, "Ugh,"
Oh,
right? And
you've
it
been
should
watching me.
be like Nakrasana, crocodile pose, you're jumping in Chaturanga. And it's that expression of like, hey, this pose isn't meant to be like a dead weight. It really
Mm.
should be buoyant. So here's my challenge to you. If you've never done chaturanga, if you practice vinyasa regularly and you've never done chaturanga with your knees down for an extended period of time, I challenge you to see what it does to your practice if for the next, dare I say it, like month or two, you only do chaturanga with your knees down and you start to feel that
Yeah.
powerfulness, that buoyancy, that control. And then after maybe a month of doing that, start to start to sprinkle in some with the knees up, and then eventually over the next month or two transitioning back to knees up. And especially those of you who feel like, I got it, I'm fine, I
Yeah.
feel masterful in all of the poses, like I think you'll be really surprised. Maybe you can post a little photo for me on Instagram and show me what you're doing. We love
I
seeing.
really like that. It's like an enforced opportunity to find that beginner's mind. And I would, sorry,
And
carry
it
on.
gives you some, like, it's nice to have some structure. If someone just says, like, you should try putting your knees down, it's kind of like, you're not going to see much just kind of doing it here or there. But if you can do it for like a month regularly and really use it to refine your chaturanga alignment, so you're
Mm.
trying to correct that tendency to lay in the front of the shoulder and have some breadth across the chest as you lower down. And
Mm.
again, the chest feels big and strong, broad and strong, and you'll be able to feel more of that buoyancy. But if you can do that for a month, and then just slowly sprinkle in some knees up chaturangas and then eventually transition to it, I think you'll be really surprised at what you feel, especially if you're curious about arm balances and inversions and things like that.
Hashtag knee down challenge.
Oh my gosh,
It's
I
going to be
love that.
huge.
That
I
was
can
so
feel it.
spontaneous too. I didn't even, no, wasn't on the list.
But this is something that I do love about the way that you teach is not just chaturanga, but I've seen this in side plank. You'll teach a million different side plank options, some of which have the bottom knee down, some of which might have the top foot down. And so it's not about, can I do a regular side plank with, just the little toe edge of the bottom foot on the floor and the top foot stacked on top. It's not, that's the ultimate aim and anything else is a step down. It's that curiosity and exploration. What happens if? How does it feel if? And it does really give you time and space to play with what you're feeling in your shoulder, what you're feeling in your side body, what you're feeling at the side of the hip. And just giving people that space to explore is, to me, the kind of point of the physical practice.
I think so too. For me, it's what makes it more functional in this sense that like it really translates to my life, because
Mm.
rarely are we just doing side plank in our life. It's not something we do. We're, like grabbing groceries out of the back seat, or like grabbing our child from a strange angle, or putting up a painting, or like there's always weird stuff. And so
Mm.
I think for me, the more weird you can get,
You can expose yourself to.
the better.
Within limits, people, within limits. But definitely exploring different loads, speeds, um, movement planes, exposing yourself in the relative safety of your practice to what happens if, how do I feel if, kind of future proofs you for life.
And once you feel comfortable, like obviously we've got to nail some of the foundations, right? But then we want to, like, not, like you said, not be overly rigid there. I think
Mm,
sometimes in side plank too, we can kind of become overly rigid. And I think we should be able to move from there and transition. What's interesting to me is all those transitions between and through, because life is a transition. It's constantly changing and moving. It's not stagnant or, well, it is sedentary now for most of us, but we sit
but
at our computers a lot.
the mischief is often in the movement, isn't it? That's where issues can come up. And so if you can prepare yourself more for that capacity to support yourself as you shift from one place or one plane to another.
So, okay, we're already kind of edging in on the tools. Let's talk about favorite tools or
No, wait, what we haven't talked about that I would really love to is we're using the shoulders in yoga practice. We do think about the shoulders in the context of weight bearing. So, plank, chaturanga, side plank, inversions, arm balances, downward facing dog. But I think we forget about the impact that the shoulders can have in other poses. So in back bends, we always think about the spine, but if we can work the shoulder blades back, like this is the one place where you really do want to be squeezing the shoulder blades back and drawing them down toward the back of the waist. They can almost act like little scoops on the back of the sternum, kind of lifting up the heart. To me, that's like 80% of the back bend
oh,
feeling right
absolutely.
there, is just opening the chest.
Well, and I really believe, well, I believe that part of back bends, a lot of it is your bony structure, but the part that we can really influence for most people, my opinion, is that for most people, once they've been practicing regularly for a year or two, they've probably maxed out the capacity for movement in their back bends, in their spine. Um,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of leeway for shoulders. Like
Yes.
for most people, especially people who practice regularly, I find, and this isn't everyone, right? But for most people, the shoulder work, the overhead shoulder work, the armpit work, Rachel,
Oh God.
the armpit work is such a big one, working in the pecs and the lats to really
Yes.
help with things like wheel overhead back bends. And it really is
Yes.
more of a shoulder issue, but it's also a genetic thing too. Like we're not all going to be able to put our feet on our head. It's just not meant to be, people. So,
Unfortunately, not required by daily life unless you work in Cirque du Soleil.
yes.
But I agree, shoulders are a much more accessible for a group class way to play with backbends because most people can get a big increase there over time. Whereas most people, you can either do wheel when you're 8, your first yoga class,
Yeah.
or I mean, and of course, you can increase your range of motion a little bit. For most people, back bends are either easy or they're hard. Whereas that shoulder mobility is
Yeah.
something that everyone can benefit from.
I feel like that doesn't really change too much. I mean, you can definitely change and work with it and do a lot to get into things and make them more accessible. There's plenty of things to do. There's a lot you can
Mm.
do. However, I think if you're one of those people that struggles with back bends, it's always going to be one. And maybe it's something to work on. But then here's the context, right? Like, am I working on it because I want to feel better in my body? Or am I working on it
Yeah.
because I want to be able to do a pretty pose? And, you can definitely work on it and get a lot of changes in your body and your life. You may or may not be able to get into those crazy deep poses because I do think there is definitely a genetic, not only a bony structure, but also connective tissue differences in
Mm.
people that are going to change things. So I always like to add that because I always want to empower people, but I also want to be realistic and not give unrealistic expectations that are frustrating.
Yeah. I think explore, but with an open mind. Like explore without this is the only end point that I am willing to accept because that's just not how the body works.
And if I think about it in a functional sense, like I know we've all had, as yoga teachers, the people who come in and they really want to be able to do like this fancy yoga pose, and you're like, oh, okay, well maybe that'll happen, maybe it won't. But if I can gravitate them toward, well, what is it that you want to capture? oh, well, I have this tension on my shoulders, or I want to be able to do this thing, or, maybe it's the empowerment of being able to do this thing. And then maybe I
Yeah.
can find, you know, other ways to support that as well. If I gravitate toward like, what do they want to get from it? That we can usually be very helpful with.
Yes,
Can we make it look
100%.
like the picture? Maybe, maybe not. Kind of depends a little on your
But
genetic.
hopefully you won't care by the time we get there because you will have learned so much from the journey.
Exactly.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, so for
So
shoulders, I feel like
backbends.
there's two big things when we talk about takeaways and applications and practices. One is stability, and one is mobility. And a lot of people
Mm.
end up on one side of that. For most of us, we're either like really flexible and the mobility is easy, but the stability is really hard, or the opposite. Of course, you can have different things in different areas of your shoulder and, a variety of things. And the curiosity is key. But let's talk about some favorite tools that we like to do. Well, let's start with mobility because we talked a bit about MFR.
Yeah, and I think honestly, everyone can benefit from mobility, even if you're somebody who has already fairly mobile shoulders. Active range of motion practices where you're really controlling the arc of movement of the shoulder blades or the arms, it's still mobility work. But if you're that sort of stretchy, bendy person, controlling that movement can be just a whole new realm to dive into that can be fascinating. That's where you, even if you're very flexible in your shoulders, can cultivate that beginner's mind of which positions are difficult for me to bring myself into using my muscles. And then, as you said, can I slow down? Can I kind of linger there? So I like
And
go.
I love the active stuff because, like you said, it's good for the people who are tighter. It's also
Mm,
great for the people who are more
yeah.
flexible. And think about it this way: I feel like there's kind of a sometimes a rigid understanding of active mobility. I hear people talk about, oh, it's so important, as if we don't do it in yoga already. But we do a lot of it in yoga. Essentially, think about active mobility anytime you're working to bring
Moving your
yourself
arms.
into a pose. Like in Gomukhasana arms, once I'm in it, like that's not active.
Mm.
But
But
I could make it active if I were maybe trying to lift my hand off the back, the lower hand, or if I was resisting something or pulling on a
yes,
strap there. Like there's definitely
that's
ways to
exactly
make
where
it
I was
active.
going.
Yeah.
You can take the familiar, you can take the sort of standard yoga pose and tweak it just a little and create a totally different experience. Like holding the arms actively in those cow face arms, gomukhasana arms, or moving from one side to the other, or pulling
Mm,
on a strap, or trying to squeeze a block between your hands. There's lots of ways to take the normal arm position and add a whole new level of interest and challenge. And for people who are more on the flexible side, that will really build strength. But for people who are on the tighter or stiffer side, it's going to build a range of motion. So that's one of my favorite places for the shoulders is active mobility, active range of motion work, and
yeah.
finding ways to play with that.
And then for more passive, keep in mind for when we're talking about just mobility is just the ability to move the joint. It doesn't really tell us whether it's passive or active, but for passive mobility work, though a lot of times I think people use that term for active work, but for passive mobility work, that MFR is such a great tool. And it's
Mm.
why, a lot of times I use it at the beginning of class as a way to prepare the tissues to be able to be moved in active ranges of motion or be stretched in passive ranges of motion. It's a great one um, for other reasons, neurologic reasons too. But its impact, like we mentioned before, is its effects are pretty immediate. And so
Yes.
you get that. And I love that. And I think there's also a place for yin, even though in yin we don't do as much shoulder work. There are plenty of ways to still work with the shoulder in different directions. If you can just
Mm.
think about what's limited. If I'm working one on one with someone, it's very specific to the person. In a group class, I'm just looking at different ways to get someone into a range of motion in a way that they can relax into.
Mm.
So,
And one of my favorite ways to use that is during Shavasana, almost as an alternative to Shavasana, find a very subtle shift in shoulder position, like having somebody lie with a rolled up, just a little hand towel between their shoulder blades or across the mid back, catching the bottom tips of the shoulder blades. So they're not feeling this massive, cracking open the heart stretch. It's subtle, But as they stay in Shavasana and the connective tissue adapts, they come out hopefully with this new sense of neutral, this kind of new starting point for their shoulders.
I love that one, which then also hits on so we're talking about mobility, passive mobility. Another important, I think, tool in a yoga practice is the posture
Mm.
and being conscious of it. We can find, this, 200, it's like a 200-hour cliche, right? Finding Tadasana in every pose. There's a
It's true,
Tadasana
though.
there. It's true. It absolutely is. And I think it's really important. But the posture and like what you're saying too, even like a Shavasana setup too, where you can embody that posture is
Mm.
important without becoming rigid. Though there's a
Mm.
place, I think, for those too. I'm now actively positioning the shoulder in different ways. What about stability? Favorite stability work?
We've hit on a lot of it already, knee down stuff. So when you can reduce the body weight enough, even for people who can easily do it with their legs straight, that there's room for experimentation. So bird dog is one of my favorite ways to train shoulder stability. That's when you're on all fours, you take one arm forward and the opposite leg back. So you're creating a more stable position with less surface area on the ground. You're lifting one arm away from the floor. You're using your support hand to push you away from the floor. So there are the actions there for plank, chaturanga, side plank, the actions for downward facing dog in a way that I sneak in almost every class, some version of bird dog. And then cat and cow, Sarada's push-ups where you're not taking the spine into back bends or forward folds. The spine is neutral, but the shoulder blades are gliding closer to the spine and then away from the spine so that you start to get more awareness of shoulder positioning. And that's often where I'll start for weight bearing. I'll finish with that pushing the floor away to sort of stretch the skin between the shoulder blades. And then we move on to bird dog or knee down plank or knee down chaturanga.
I love the serratus push-ups, and I think it's such a great place to start if you're doing those knee down chaturangas. And again, if you're whether you're wanting to work with a shoulder issue, whether you're wanting to work toward more strength and weight bearing postures or work outside of yoga, or wanting to work more preventatively, I think doing some of those serratus push-ups can be really helpful. And so serratus push-ups, for those of you who aren't familiar, you can do this in plank with your knees down or up. The key is that you're not bending your elbows and you're drawing your shoulder blades back toward each other and then away from each other. So your chest is your rib cage is kind of moving toward and away from the floor, but you're not sagging in your lower back. So the low back stays supported. Imagine you have like a rod through your spine to some extent there. And then I'm really trying to focus on what I call the GQ muscles, because they're the ones you see in men on the cover of the GQ magazine. Right? You see those.
You've definitely created a visual for me now that I get every single time. There's a white button up shirt, it's open. Maybe they're at the beach. There's been some salt spray. That's the image that comes to my mind every time you talk.
No, their shirts off. That's why, right?
It's open. It's open because of the
don't.
breeze from the surf.
But they're
Maybe I've spent a little too much time thinking about this.
they're the serrations that you see, right? So that they're attaching to each of the ribs there. And so, on women, we don't see it as much, mainly because we don't take our shirts off, in public. But, they're the little serrations there. And it's a really important one that I feel gets overlooked. It's not everything, right? You can't just like do serratus push-ups and make all your problems disappear. But I think it's a really helpful one, and it just threads easily into a yoga practice. If you're
Mm.
working on shoulders, you could do it instead of doing the vinyasa. There's another one, maybe a month of skipping your vinyasas and doing serratus push-ups throughout the class. And although you might need to do more than just a couple at a time to really feel it, depending.
It's also a really good preparation for another one of my favorite stability practices for the shoulders, which is side plank or vasisthasana. And again, I'm talking mostly knee down variations where you've got some space to play with your shoulders. Just because with the arm out to the side instead of the arm in front of us, we're really forced to create more of that broadness across the collarbones. It's sort of easier to do it with an arm out wide than it is with the arms in front of us, where we naturally recruit the pecs, the big, strong muscles that cross the chest. So I love side plank and I use it a lot because it's, to me, a great way to create shoulder strength and stability, but with that broad, open chest.
I find that one's such a hard one too for a lot of times for bodybuilders. Or maybe it's just my husband struggles with that one a lot, and he's never really wanted to take the time to really break it down.
I
And I'm
mean, hey,
always like,
most
"There
people hate it.
you
Most people are not fans of side plank, and they're
go."
especially not fans of making it easier in inverted commas. But just the space to get some nuance in your shoulder positioning, it can't be underestimated. The impact that that can have, even for people who are super strong. Playing with the details is
And
valuable.
when you find that hard thing, you're like, "That's the thing I need to focus on," right?
Hmm.
There's your gem.
Definitely.
Um, and so just to kind of conclude and bring all of this together, let's just kind of, I'm going to mention a few other things that I think are important. Of course, some of the things that are more familiar to us, we talked about posture, but chest stretches, working on the back of the shoulder. I know you and I both love that and are big fans of it.
Yes.
And so thinking about anything you can do for the posterior shoulder. I know I have classes on, I think you do too, on posterior
Hmm.
shoulder and on rotator cuff. Working on that rotator cuff, whether you have issues or not, can be such important work, and is kind of beyond, it's a little more specific than I think we can get to in a podcast, but
Yeah, it's all really detailed work.
Google it or look on our site. I love coming up with creative stuff to work on that because you get kind of bored of the cliche physical
Windshield
therapy
wipers.
TheraBand,
Yeah,
rotations, which
which is
again
still good.
only it's great, but it only trains you in one direction.
Yeah.
It's still very limited. And so yeah, stick with that if you got it from your PT and you need it, that's your individualized instruction, but know that at some point you're going to have to expand beyond that. Keep in mind the shoulder strength is so helpful for these other areas we talked about, the neck, the upper
Neck.
back, the wrist.
Massive.
We didn't even talk about wrist and
Yes,
elbow. So important for wrist and
absolutely.
elbow, for breath, and leaning into that curiosity of appreciating the things that are challenging as little nuggets of information, of learning the owner's manual to your body in this moment, which is constantly changing. And as we grab our hands on the steering wheel and really consciously choose some of these things or lean into some of these things, we are actively steering that, how the tissues are adapting to those demands through that consciousness. And it's one of the reasons why I think yoga is such an important part of all different forms of healthcare and
And I
wellness.
think that's one thing that I want people to take away is for the shoulders, yes, a balance of strength and stability, but because they are this kind of forgotten or underappreciated joint, just simple awareness and curiosity can be so powerful because there are so many movements, muscular actions, muscles themselves that we are unfamiliar with in this region of the body, that just taking the time to explore those details can really change your experience, not just in your yoga practice, but in stuff that you're doing in daily life too. I hope I hope this worked. I hope this succeeded in getting people excited
Inspired
about the
you to
shoulders.
care for those amazing, powerful, capable shoulders that you have and
Yes.
be able to tap into that in your yoga practice too. That's what I love as a teacher, is being able to tap into so many different resources and tools, and on this podcast to be able to bring some of the details, the nuances to life. And then of course, if you're a teacher and you want more deeper insights beyond what we can provide in an hour here, we have our full length shoulder teacher training, which goes into so many details on not only understanding the joint and how it moves, but also looking at how to do an evaluation, how to screen the people you work with for different issues so you know where to start and where to begin, and
Mm.
how to apply this therapeutic model to your students, whether they're injured, looking to prevent, or looking to challenge the tissues. So we go through a lot of details in there. And then if you're a student, we've got so many resources on Yoga Medicine Online, for you for practicing lots of shoulder stuff. I've got lots of rotator cuff. Rachel's got a lot of stuff for the shoulders. You
I've
can
got a
just
whole series on essentials for the shoulders.
there you
Yeah, but
go.
we've got a free YouTube video as well. If you don't like the sales pitch at the end on shoulder stability and how important that can be. So many resources. We'll link to them.
Well, it's
It
not a
really is worth
sales
the
pitch. It's just if you want it. Like
if
I
you're
find
interested.
things too, whether you're whatever you're coming for is like, I just want to be here to help you. If you join one of our
Yeah.
trainings, great. If you're back on the podcast, I want to help you find what's helpful on your mat so that you can
Mm.
explore and be empowered with these tools, because it's such a great practice that is accessible and relevant for so many people. And so if you're looking for those resources, they're there, but we've got plenty of free ones, or you can do our knees down challenge.
Hashtag knee down challenge. This is going to go like wildfire. I can feel it.
Let us know how it goes. We always love your feedback, and I hope this was helpful, you guys. We look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.